Mr. Foote, in two recent by-elections, the Labour Party has done disastrously. The opinion polls show that the government, and Mrs Thatcher in particular, have never been more popular. And the Labour Party seems to be split by internal strife once again. And yet this is probably the run-up to an election next year. What are you doing to put your Labour's house in order to attract the voters back to Labour's cause?
The first thing I'm sure we must always continue to do, whatever the distractions, whatever the setbacks, whatever the attempts of people to divert us, is to state to the country as clearly as we can what we can do to save this country from the disastrous situation at home and to some extent abroad as well. At home, there's mass unemployment, and we are the only party that's really got a policy for dealing with it. We also see masses of poor people who are having to suffer under the kind of policies of the Thatcher government, and we've got to show that we've got the way of bringing back some compassion into our society. We've also got to state clearly to the country how we can stop the nuclear arms race, how we can bring a genuine peace to the world. Now, that's the way in which we can win the votes and the support and the conscientious backing of the British people, and I believe that's what we've got to do right from now up to the election.
But you can't, of course, do any of that if the party is split, can you, Mr. Foote? What are you doing to unite the party?
Well, by continuing to present those policies, I must insist that indeed last week and this week we have published the general programme of the party to deal with many of these matters, and I believe that the more those documents are read, the more they can help to unify the purpose of the party, because they help to recall some of the real objectives of the party. And I'm certainly going to go on right from this day to the time when I believe we can win the next election, stating the democratic socialist principles in which we believe and also how we should apply them to the people who are getting hurt now.
Mr. Foote, let me turn to events of this week, to yesterday's decision of the National Executive to instruct Militant to put their house in order, to stop being a party within a party within 3 months or face expulsion. What exactly does that mean?
Well, what it means is that we are determined to apply and carry out the Constitution of the Labour Party. The Constitution of the Labour Party lays it down that there shall not be secret groups that are operating in defiance of the Constitution itself. And we had a report this week from our General Secretary and our National Agent to the two principal officers of the party saying that the Militant Tendency was in breach and defiance of the Constitution. And the National Executive of the party, particularly the leader of the party, has an absolute obligation to protect the Constitution, to ensure that it's upheld. That is also laid down in our Constitution, and that's what we are doing. That's what those words mean, and I'm sure that when we take that issue to the party conference, we will get overwhelming support for it, and I'm sure also that will assist us in securing the unity that we need to have in order to win the election.
You're not getting overwhelming support on this issue from Mr. Benn and from others already. Isn't the most likely result of yesterday's decision another 3 months of internal strife within the Labour Party, ending in another bitter row at conference?
Well, of course there will be considerable arguments on the matter.
I said bitter strife, Mr. Foote.
Yeah, no, I understand what you said. Of course there are arguments about the matter. There were on the executive, and some of the arguments were furious ones. I'm not seeking to minimize the point, but I'm emphasizing that what Mr. Benn, or Tony Benn, said on the steps yesterday when he came out, he didn't describe what was the point at issue, because he never mentioned, as far as I can see, upholding the party constitution. He has as much an obligation to uphold that constitution as I have, the rest of us have, and I believe that the more that fact becomes known throughout the country, the more the support in the party will come for the proposition which was carried by a considerable majority on the executive. So this matter can be properly settled by the proposals that have been carried by the executive, and indeed, I repeat, there is an absolute obligation on every member of the party to uphold that constitution.
Mr. Foote, you've referred to Militant as a pestilential nuisance, a secret conspiracy. Mr. Shaw yesterday talked of a plot against the Labour Party. Why didn't you simply expel them?
Well, we could have simply expelled them under the provision.
Did you dodge the issue?
No, we didn't dodge the issue. I think we dealt with it in a better way. What we did under my motion and proposal, what we did last December was to set up an inquiry into it, and we put in charge of that inquiry the two chief officers of the party, the General Secretary and the National Agent. They came forward with the report to which I've already referred, and the main item in that report is that they declare that the Militant Tendency is acting in contravention of the Constitution. Now, of course, it's true. We could have proceeded, or it could have proceeded from there to say, all right, we'll take disciplinary action against some members of the Militant
But isn't it
Tendency.
their views
well,
that
no,
are in
but
the argument?
No, it isn't their views. It's their organisation that we're dealing with, and that is the meaning of a secret conspiracy. But let me just complete, if I may, the part of the report, because the report presented to us by the General Secretary and the National Agent did not only say this, although that was, of course, the most important part of the report, but they went on to describe a method which they thought could be used for dealing with this problem and for ensuring that it didn't recur in a similar way in the future. And that was the establishment of this register. I believe it is a proper way to proceed. That also commanded the support of the executive, and I believe it would have been very strange if I'd accepted one part of the report and said, I'm not going to take any notice of the other part. What we did get was complete endorsement of the whole of that report, and I believe the whole of that report points the way into where we can solve this problem and solve it in accordance with the tolerance and the liberal methods which our party has always sought to uphold, or at any rate some sections have always sought to uphold. One of my deepest concerns about the whole of the operations of Militant Tendency, and some other groups as well, is the intolerance that they have introduced into certain sections of the party, and I believe the way we are dealing with it can help to restore the tolerance and goodwill and good ways of running our affairs, which ought to be a hallmark of the party, and indeed which I believe still is the fundamental strength of the party, and which can enable us to win the election as well, so long as people can see that that is the dominant mood in the party itself.
Mr. Foote, let me put one more question to you about militant before we move on. But there are 9 militant candidates already selected to stand. They have views, many of them have expressed views deeply opposing parliamentary democracy. Are they going to stand under the Labour Party banner? What advice do you give tomorrow night to the good Labour comrades of Bradford North when they meet in a reselection conference with a militant candidate?
Well, I could easily give the comrades there the same advice I gave them several months ago. I certainly don't think it would be wise for them to vote for a Militant Tendency supporter and candidate, and indeed I urge that they should vote for Ben Ford, who was their previous member. But all those who are supporters of Militant Tendency, assuming that the report goes through in the basis that I'm pretty sure it will, that is to say, I do not see how Militant Tendency, which is a secret conspiracy in the Labour Party, I do not see how they can alter their nature and accommodate themselves to these rules, which are good democratic rules. So in my opinion, Militant Tendency, certainly in its present form, cannot be a part of the party, and that is indeed what the General Secretary and the agents say. I believe that will be confirmed.
Nor its 9 people
I believe
candidates.
It will be confirmed in 3 months' time, and therefore both the candidates concerned and the parties concerned will have to choose whether they want to be members of Militant Tendency or members of the Labour Party. And I believe that overwhelmingly the mass of people who may have been misled into support of Militant Tendency will want to remain members of the Labour Party, and that is the choice that will rest with them. This is not any witch hunt or anything of the sort. It is placing clearly before the members of the party up and down the country what is necessary in order to sustain our Constitution. We cannot allow our Constitution to be destroyed by a tiny number of people, and that is what we are determined to resist.
Okay, let's move on to your own style of leadership. Mr. Foote, you were elected because many MPs thought you were the man to reunite the party. Yet the outsider, and in fact some MPs, might be forgiven for thinking the party is in greater disarray as ever. Polls suggest that only 14% of the voters think you're doing a good job. How do you rate your own performance?
Well, I think we could have quite a good party with the 14%, you know, and I'm thinking...
14?
14, yes, I know, it's still quite a number, you know, several millions, but still, there you are. Of course, we've got to make a lot of improvements on the...
How do you rate your own performance?
Well, you know, I would, of course, very much prefer if we didn't have some of these distractions. I think the biggest distraction that the Labour Party had over the last year was the contest for the deputy leadership, and I think the arguments associated with it did do considerable injury to the party. However, I hope we won't have any recurrence of that kind of nonsense this time. And I believe that the party up and down the country recognises that the many measures have got to be taken to pull itself together, because after all we do face a situation when our people, particularly Labour people, are threatened as they've not been threatened since the 1930s. We face a situation next week, for example, industrially, a very serious crisis indeed. We've been doing our very best behind the scenes and in discussions with those concerned to stop it, but we've got a government which apparently not merely doesn't take any steps to stop a major industrial clash such as we're going to have on the railways. If anything, they seem to encourage it. They certainly stand by and don't take any steps to avoid what can be an appalling industrial crisis for the country. It's going to inflict very serious losses on the country's production, and it is going to injure our industrial relations for many years to come.
Can I come back to the railways and stick with your leadership just for a moment? It has been called into question. You have been criticised. Is there any chance of you resigning?
Not at all. No? Not in the slightest. And I don't believe that nobody has suggested it to me.
Do you see any signs of a plot that's spoken about?
No, I don't see any such plot. I occasionally read a critical voice in the newspapers, or possibly even on television somebody may raise a voice of criticism. However, I've got plenty of powers of self-criticism too, and I can assure you I apply them. But I also have some knowledge of the history of our country and of people who've become prime ministers in the past. And I suppose there has never been any leading politician in British history who was more unpopular in his own party and elsewhere than Benjamin Disraeli was just a few months before he became prime minister and stayed there for another 6 years. So, you know, these fashions in politics, or tests, or popularity polls, whatever you may like to call them, I know it's supposed to be done by scientific methods now, but those are not the guides to what really determines politics. I believe when the British people go to the polls next, they will be considering all that has happened to them over these past 3 or 4 years, the industrial collapse, the injury to our country's economy, how we are to escape from it. I think that will be strongly in their minds. I think also the whole international situation will be strongly in their minds, and I believe that as democratic socialists we must direct all our appeal to those feelings and emotions in the country, and the more we're able to do so, the more I believe our chance of winning that election will grow. I think everything is open for that election. I don't believe any prophet is fool enough to say that the election is settled. Of course it's not. It's all open to be played for and worked for and argued for in a democratic way, and that's what we're going to do.
Let's turn now to the Falklands crisis. The government, of course, made huge advances in their popularity in the polls, which we refer to, scientific or otherwise, during the Falklands crisis. I know the argument that people rallied around the flag in times of crisis and of war. But isn't the truth that the public found Labour's front bench views equivocal in its support of the government, and confused what you were saying, perhaps, and what Dennis Healey was saying, with Tony Benn's out-and-out opposition to the war, a confusion leading to what some call the Foot-Benn syndrome? Wasn't there that confusion? And isn't it always that confusion that you face, not only on the Falklands, on other things? Who speaks for the Labour Party, people say? Is it Benn? Is it Foot?
Well, it's on this matter. It's the front bench of the Labour Party that speaks for the Labour Party and the National Executive.
Doesn't do any good, though, does it?
Well, that supported me throughout my view throughout the whole of the crisis. Now, of course, there's no denying that Mrs. Thatcher has gained in popularity during the crisis. Nobody could dispute it, and the attraction and interest and fascination of the whole of the Falklands crisis, I think, of course, assisted the government. We did not absolutely rejected the line that Tony Benn advocated because we believed that action had to be taken to see that Galtieri and the people who'd taken over in the Falklands Islands were removed. And we took a very different line. I can understand, not Tony Benn especially, there's a strong pacifist section in the party, and I respect their views too. They were not in favour of the use of any military force. But our line, the Labour Party line, was in full accordance with our traditions. And
what I'm
indeed,
saying to you, Mr. Foote, if I may interrupt you, I'm sorry, but that people didn't understand that, did they? There was, again, this misunderstanding that Labour was not speaking with one clear voice.
Yes, but I think that the more people look back at it, they will see that what we were saying was sense, because right from the very beginning, we said that we had to uphold the Charter of the United Nations. We said we had to work with the Secretary-General of the United Nations. On 2 or 3 occasions when the government itself didn't realize the importance of that, we had to pull them back and push them onto that course. And on many occasions when the government appeared to be neglecting the fact that we had to have international support in order to carry through what we did. And if it had not been for the passage of the Resolution 502 at the United Nations and the support which we in the Labour Party gave to it, if it had not been for that, then the support of this country in many other parts of the world would not have been forthcoming in the strength that it was. I'm very glad that the Commonwealth as a whole supported the British view. I'm very glad that common market countries did. I'm glad in the end, although they took a bit of time to do it, that the United States came along to support us. But sometimes the government forgets, and others forget, that none of that would have been possible if it had not been for the support we received at the United Nations. And I say that that is crucial to the future foreign policy of this country, and it is Labour's emphasis on that international policy which I believe will command growing support over the period ahead. In moments of crisis it may get forgotten, but we will have to come back to it.
Why are you so anxious that the inquiry into it should not span 20 years, i.e. other governments, but merely the more recent events? Is it because you believe that other governments and Labour governments have skeletons in their cupboard on this issue?
Not at all. I've got no objection to a longer inquiry over a period of 20 years, 40 years, 50 years. Not any objection whatsoever. Indeed, the comparison between what this government did about the Falklands and what the Callaghan government did is stark and clear, because Callaghan took precautionary measures in 1977 when there were rumours then that there was going to be an invasion by the Argentine of the Falklands. He took preventive action and sent a few ships to the right place and made sure that the notice of that was sent through to the Argentine. We certainly have not the slightest desire to prevent any discussion or examination of that matter. But what we do say is that the most urgent question of all is what went wrong on this particular occasion. What led to the crisis? What led to the deaths of some 250 British servicemen and large numbers of others? What was the cause of that crisis? Now, if there's any question of anybody trying to hide anything, it appears that Mrs. Thatcher would prefer to have a much more extensive inquiry. Well, we haven't settled that argument yet. We're still going to have discussions with her, and I would have thought, in the light of the recent information which has emerged of how Mrs. Thatcher was writing in the beginning of February to people saying that it wasn't any necessary to take any further steps to protect the Falklands, and the small number of Marines that we had there was quite sufficient to deal with the problem. It's quite clear that Mrs. Thatcher's own judgment is involved in the immediate occasion. And if Lord Carrington, the Foreign Secretary, thought it was right for him to resign because of what he called a national humiliation, well, it's clear that Mrs. Thatcher is involved in that part of the humiliation, and that is the matter which I've thought the country has a right to know about. But let me repeat, of course I'm not opposed to a longer inquiry, but we don't want such a long inquiry that we never hear about it for the next 10 years.
Less chance of her resigning than of you, I'd have thought.
No, neither of us are going to resign as far as I know, but I think that she's got quite a lot to answer for on how we got into the crisis, and I hope that she's going to come clean on it and let us have an immediate inquiry which will go into these immediate questions, including also the evidence which has come in the last few hours from the captain of the Endurance about the warnings that he was giving. It looks as if this government and Mrs. Thatcher at its head had warning after warning that there was real danger in the Falklands, but a danger of invasion, but they didn't take any notice.
Okay,
Jim Callaghan took some notice and took some action about it.
Let's move on. You referred earlier to the threatened railway strike. There's also, of course, a dispute in the health service. You have some experience of disputes in the health service because it was the health service strike in the winter of discontent that helped to bring down the last Labour government. Isn't the only likely result of these disputes Whether or not the men have a justified case or not, isn't the only likely result going to be that people are going to see that the unions are too strong once again, and that they use that strength and their power irresponsibly to hurt other helpless people?
Well, in the case of the health worker strikes, I'll come to the railways, there's no difference. They're not using it to injure people. In the case of the health workers strike, it is not a strike to injure people. It is a strike to get what are perfectly legitimate demands from the health workers, and we in the Labour Party strongly back them. One of the reasons why we've got into this trouble is because with this government, when it came into power, dismantled the arrangements that we had made, partly as a result of the last strike. I fully acknowledge that, but we came to an agreement with them under which there would be some proper relationship between the pay that goes to nurses and others in the health service, because it's not only the nurses involved, and the pay going to other people. And if that machinery, the Clegg Commission, had been kept, then I believe nurses and others would be getting a better deal at this moment, and heaven knows they deserve it. So it's not a question of their being responsible for the situation, and the primary cause of the situation there is government policy. And in the case of the railways, as I've already mentioned, what the government has done is just to sit back and say, we'll have nothing to do with it. We're washing our hands of the whole affair. We won't care whether, in fact,
What should they do?
cut off. Well, I think what they should do what every intelligent government has done when they're faced with an industrial crisis of this. No, not give in. They should intervene and try to see the cause of the problem. And if they did that, they would discover that what the cause of the problem is, the failure to get the proper investment in the industry, which the railwaymen, and indeed I would hope the Railway Board, would believe is right for the government at this juncture to supply. You could solve this crisis if the government was prepared to intervene on that basis. You could save this country hundreds of millions of pounds, and indeed it may be even worse than that, because if you do have a railway strike in this situation, it's going to inflict great injury on other workers, other people. People in the coal is going to be hit. Other factories are going to be hit. People are going to be made bankrupt by it. I say that it is an absolute dereliction of duty for the government not to intervene. There's time still. They could do it before Monday, before the strike starts.
Tea and sandwiches at number 10 again.
Well, that's better than having pouring the wealth of the country down the drain in an industrial crisis in which the unions, all the unions, will think that they are justified. The National Union of Railwaymen is led by Sid Wheel, very often regarded and praised in conservative newspapers. I'm not saying that against him, but he's praised as a great moderate. He is leading a so-called moderate union. That union has been outraged by the treatment they have received. They are also a union that holds together. I think it's a great error for Peter Parker to make the kind of suggestions that he's made to them about injuring the nature of the union himself. So we are facing
strike break.
Yeah, no, we are facing a very serious industrial crisis, the most serious for quite a long time, and for the government of a democratic country to stand back and say, we don't care, let them bash themselves to pieces. That's not the proper way to proceed. And eventually the government will have to intervene. I say they ought to intervene next Monday before the damage starts.
Throughout this interview, perhaps not at the end there, but on questions earlier on, a sort of spectre haunted us, the spectre of Tony Benn. Mm-hmm. Does he haunt you? Is he one day going to be a leader of this party?
No, I don't think he's going to be leader of this party. Perfect right to advocate his views, but he shouldn't go around saying that anybody's trying to suppress him. I must say, if anybody's been trying to suppress his views or other people expressing their views, it's a very strange tale. Nobody is doing that at all. All that we're doing, I don't know why he says it, because...
Why won't he be leader? Why do you think he won't be leader?
Well, I don't think he'll get the support of the movement precisely because he doesn't stand up for some of his own decisions. When he makes decisions, he doesn't always stand by them. I think he's not standing up now for what he should do, because he is as much committed as I am to upholding the constitution of the Labour Party, and I think I should have a right to call on his assistance in that aim. But still, that's another matter. What he is also not entitled to do is, instead of facing the issue, which is the issue of how we are going to sustain the constitution, to make suggestions or allegations about the motives of all others concerned, including others who sit in the same cabinet as himself. He suggests that the others in the party, and that must be myself, are engaged in some attempt to get a coalition. He doesn't absolutely say it straight and clear like that to me, and I don't suppose he would dare to, because he knows I've been opposing such coalitions much longer than ever he has. So, you know, I don't believe he's ever going to win on that account, but there we are. We will continue these arguments. I hope that by the time we come to the conference that Tony Benn and others will have made up their minds to uphold the Constitution, that they're as much pledged to uphold as I am.
Michael Foot, thank you very much.